"Look what we have here, another diversity hire pretending she belongs," Richard Steinberg sneered, grabbing Amara Williams by the shoulder and dragging her toward the auction stage. The billionaire's grip tightened as he forced the priceless Guarneri violin into her hands. "You want equality so badly. Here's your shot, sweetheart. Play something classical for your betters." His cronies erupted in cruel laughter as phones emerged throughout the Metropolitan Arts Center's ballroom. Steinberg leaned closer, his voice a venomous whisper that carried across the silent room. "When you embarrass yourself up there, remember, you asked for this. Your people always do." Amara stood trapped in the spotlight, her catering uniform wrinkled where his fingers had grabbed her. The $3 million instrument felt impossibly heavy in her shaking hands. "Tick-tock!" Steinberg called out, stepping back with theatrical flourish. "We don't have all night for your little minstrel show." The first note that escaped her violin silenced every cruel laugh in the room. Have you ever witnessed humiliation transform into the most powerful form of justice? 3 hours earlier, Amara Williams had tied her hair back in the cramped employee break room of Manhattan's most exclusive catering company, her reflection staring back from a cracked mirror that had seen better days. At 28, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate spaces where she wasn't welcome. Her grandmother's medication bottles rattled in her purse, a daily reminder of why she endured the subtle slights and barely concealed contempt that came with serving New York's elite. The Arts for All charity gala represented everything Amara had once dreamed of joining, not serving. The irony wasn't lost on her that tonight's event raised money for inner-city music programs, while the very people who needed those programs remained invisible, relegated to carrying trays and clearing plates. She'd watched these same socialites write checks for causes they'd never personally encountered, their generosity stopping at the service entrance. Richard Steinberg's reputation preceded him into every room he entered. The 52-year-old tech mogul had built his empire on the backs of brilliant minds he systematically underpaid, particularly those who didn't look like him. His public persona championed meritocracy and colorblind hiring. But the diversity lawsuit his company had quietly settled 6 months ago told a different story. The settlement papers, leaked to industry blogs, revealed a pattern of humiliating talented employees of color until they quit, rather than face prolonged legal battles they couldn't afford. Tonight, Steinberg sat at table 1, a position he'd purchased with his $5 million donation. The amount guaranteed him influence over which programs received funding, and his track record suggested the money would flow toward institutions that already served privileged communities. He'd arrived 40 minutes late, keeping the entire ballroom waiting because punctuality was for people who needed to impress others. The evening's centerpiece sat on the auction stage like a sleeping beauty, a 1947 Guarneri del Gesù violin worth $3.2 million. The instrument had been donated by an anonymous collector specifically to raise funds for the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra, a program that provided free instruments and lessons to children in underserved communities. The violin represented hope, a chance for talented young musicians to touch greatness, even if they could never own it. Amara had circled that stage 3 times during setup, her fingers unconsciously moving through scales she hadn't played in 2 years. The muscle memory remained strong, hidden beneath the calluses from her 3 jobs. She'd trained at Juilliard on a full scholarship, her talent so undeniable that even the most traditional professors couldn't ignore it. But talent didn't pay for emergency surgery, and dreams didn't keep the lights on when medical bills mounted beyond imagination. The night her grandmother collapsed, Amara had been preparing for her senior recital. The piece was Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto in E minor, the same concerto that had earned her the scholarship, the same music that had once made her believe she could transcend the limitations others placed on her future. Instead, she'd withdrawn from school, sold her violin, and learned that survival sometimes meant sacrificing the very thing that made life worth living. Steinberg's table had been demanding all evening. Extra champagne, special dietary requests that weren't actually special, and the kind of casual rudeness that wealthy people inflicted on service staff because they could. He'd already sent back his appetizer twice, not because anything was wrong with it, but because making the black waitress return to the kitchen repeatedly seemed to amuse his companions. "These people have no work ethic," he'd announced loudly enough for Amara to hear as she approached with his third replacement dish. Always looking for handouts instead of earning their place. The comment hit its target. Amara's grandmother had worked 2 jobs her entire life, cleaning office buildings at night and watching neighbors' children during the day. Amara herself worked catering on weekends, taught private music lessons on weekdays, and picked up overnight shifts at a 24-hour diner when medical bills demanded it. But to Steinberg and his circle, her existence boiled down to a stereotype they could dismiss without thought. As the evening's auction began, the violin's case was opened with ceremonial reverence. The instrument's varnish caught the chandelier light, and its curves seemed to promise music that could move souls. The auctioneer's voice carried across the ballroom as he described the violin's provenance, its perfect condition, and its potential to transform young lives through the programs it would fund. Amara watched from the service station, her heart recognizing something her rational mind tried to suppress. The violin called to her across the room, a siren song of possibility she couldn't afford to hear. The moment arrived with the casual cruelty that only absolute privilege could produce. Steinberg had been watching Amara throughout the auction, his eyes tracking her movements like a predator studying prey. When she approached his table to refill water glasses, he struck. "Wait right there, honey," he commanded, his voice cutting through the auctioneer's presentation. The entire ballroom's attention shifted as he stood, his imposing frame towering over her. "I have an idea that'll really test this whole diversity in the arts nonsense." Amara froze, the water pitcher heavy in her hands. She'd served enough of these events to recognize the warning signs, but escape was impossible with 300 pairs of eyes suddenly focused on her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steinberg announced, gesturing toward the violin on stage, "we keep throwing money at programs for underserved communities, but do we actually know if these people have any real talent?" His smile was razor sharp. "Here's our chance to find out." He grabbed Amara's elbow, his fingers digging into her arm hard enough to leave marks. "Since you're here serving the people who actually contribute to society, why don't you show us what all that diversity training money bought us?" The auction house representative looked mortified. "Mr. Steinberg, the violin isn't—" "I'll double my donation," Steinberg interrupted, his grip tightening on Amara's arm. $10 million if she can play one complete piece without embarrassing herself. But when she fails, and we all know she will, I want everyone here to remember that merit matters more than melanin." Cruel laughter rippled through his table as phones emerged from evening bags. This was entertainment now, a spectacle for social media. Amara felt the familiar weight of being reduced to a symbol, a representative of her entire race forced to prove her worthiness to people who'd already decided her value. "What's it going to be, sweetheart?" Steinberg's voice dripped with false concern. "Are you going to admit you're just here to serve, or are you brave enough to humiliate yourself in front of New York's finest?" The violin waited on stage, $3 million of carved wood and possibility. Amara looked at it, then back at Steinberg's expectant sneer. Her voice, when it came, was steady despite her trembling hands. "I'll play." The walk to the stage felt like a death march through enemy territory. Every step echoed in the sudden silence as Manhattan's elite turned in their chairs, phones already recording what they expected to be a viral humiliation. Amara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her stride remained steady, a defiance born from years of surviving spaces designed to break her spirit. Steinberg followed close behind, his voice a constant stream of poison. "This should be educational for everyone," he announced to the crowd. "Sometimes reality checks are exactly what people need." The auction house representative hovered nervously by the violin case, his face pale with the knowledge that careers could be ruined by whatever happened next. "Miss, perhaps we should—" "Let her touch it," Steinberg interrupted with theatrical magnanimity. "I want no excuses when this goes exactly as we all expect." Amara reached the stage and paused before the open case. The Guarneri del Gesù lay there like a sleeping legend, its amber varnish glowing under the spotlights. Her hands, steadier now, lifted the instrument with the reverence it deserved. The weight was perfect, the balance exactly what her muscle memory craved. "Careful with that," Steinberg called out, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. It's worth more than you'll earn in your lifetime. Actually, it's probably worth more than your entire bloodline will ever contribute to society." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. This was their world, their rules, their entertainment. Amara tested the violin's tuning with gentle precision, each adjustment revealing the depth of her knowledge. Her posture transformed as she positioned the instrument. Back straight, chin rest settled perfectly, bow held with professional grace. The change was so complete that several musicians in the audience leaned forward, recognizing something they hadn't expected to see. "Choose something simple," Steinberg taunted, settling into a front-row seat like a Roman emperor awaiting gladiatorial combat. "We wouldn't want you to attempt something beyond your capabilities." But Amara had already made her choice. Not just the piece she would play, but the battle she would fight. This wasn't about Steinberg anymore. This was for every talented person who'd been told they didn't belong, every dreamer forced to serve those who'd inherited their opportunities. She raised the bow to the strings, closed her eyes, and found her center in the silence before the storm. The first note emerged like a prayer answered by angels. Bach's Air on the G string floated across the Metropolitan Arts Center with such crystalline purity that conversations died mid-sentence. The melody, deceptively simple yet impossibly demanding, filled every corner of the ballroom with the kind of beauty that made hearts forget to beat. Amara's bow moved across the strings with surgical precision, each phrase unfolding like petals of sound that had never known imperfection. Steinberg's smug expression faltered within the first 5 seconds. The transformation was complete and undeniable. The nervous waitress had vanished, replaced by a virtuoso whose every movement spoke of years spent in pursuit of musical perfection. Her vibrato was silk and steel, her intonation so pure it seemed to bend the very air around her. This wasn't talent. This was artistry of the highest order, the kind that emerged perhaps once in a generation. Phone screens throughout the ballroom captured every note as the audience sat transfixed. At table 7, renowned violinist Elena Vasquez slowly lowered her champagne glass, her trained ear recognizing technique that belonged on the world's greatest stages. At table 12, the New York Philharmonic's concertmaster leaned forward, his professional skepticism crumbling with each perfectly executed phrase. But Amara wasn't finished revealing her secrets. As Bach's original melody reached its emotional peak, she began to weave in variations that shouldn't have been possible. Jazz harmonies emerged from classical foundations, creating a conversation between centuries of musical tradition. Her improvisation was fearless yet respectful, showing not just technical mastery but creative genius that transcended formal education. She was speaking multiple musical languages simultaneously, proving that talent didn't recognize the boundaries others tried to impose. The violin itself seemed to come alive in her hands, the Guarneri's legendary voice, which had remained silent for months in its display case, sang with renewed purpose. Every note carried the weight of 3 centuries of musical history, channeled through an artist who understood that great instruments demanded great souls to unlock their secrets. Steinberg shifted uncomfortably in his front-row seat, his companions exchanging glances that spoke volumes. This wasn't going according to plan. The humiliation they'd anticipated was transforming into something else entirely, a revelation that threatened everything they believed about who deserved to touch greatness. "Impossible," one of his table mates whispered, loud enough to be caught by nearby phones. Where did she learn to play like that? The answer was written in every movement of Amara's body. This was Juilliard training, conservatory discipline, and natural gifts, honed through years of dedication. But more than that, this was the voice of someone who'd been silenced, finding her power again. Each note carried the weight of dreams deferred but never destroyed. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Amara opened her eyes for the first time since beginning. Her gaze found Steinberg's face and held it, her expression serene yet unmistakably defiant. She wasn't playing for his approval or anyone else's. She was playing because the music demanded to be heard, because talent refused to be buried beneath the weight of others' limitations. The final phrase emerged like a blessing. Bach's genius filtered through a soul that understood both suffering and transcendence. The last note hung in the air for what felt like eternity, a perfect sphere of sound that seemed reluctant to fade. When silence finally returned to the ballroom, it carried a weight that hadn't been there before. 8 seconds passed before the first person began to clap. Then the Metropolitan Arts Center erupted. The applause wasn't polite charity gala acknowledgement. It was the thunderous recognition reserved for moments that changed everything. People leaped to their feet, their phones forgotten as they surrendered to the raw emotion of witnessing something extraordinary. Shouts of "Brava!" echoed from the musicians' tables, while tears streamed down faces that had seen everything but had never seen this. Steinberg remained seated, his face a mask of confusion and something approaching fear. The narrative he'd constructed, the comfortable story that allowed him to dismiss entire populations, lay in ruins at his feet. The applause continued, wave after wave of recognition that threatened to drown his worldview entirely. But the most telling moment came from an unexpected source. Steinberg's own wife, Patricia, stood slowly at their table, her hands coming together in applause that grew stronger with each beat. Her eyes, when they met her husband's, carried a message he'd never seen there before: shame. Deep, undeniable shame for the man she'd married and the values she'd allowed him to represent. Social media was already exploding. #Violin Goddess began trending within minutes, accompanied by video clips that would be viewed millions of times before the night was over. Comments poured in from around the world, each one a small rebellion against the assumption that talent belonged to any particular group or class. "Who is she?" dominated the live streams. "This is why representation matters. When prejudice meets perfection." The auction house representative approached cautiously, his earlier nervousness replaced by something approaching awe. Professional musicians were leaving their seats to get closer to the stage, their trained eyes studying Amara's technique, their ears still processing what they'd just witnessed. Elena Vasquez was among them, her face wearing the expression of someone who'd just solved a mystery that had been troubling her for years. She moved through the crowd with purpose, her recognition of Amara's playing style triggering memories she thought she'd filed away forever. But Amara remained on stage, the violin still cradled in her arms like a long-lost friend. The applause washed over her, but her eyes stayed fixed on Steinberg's face. She watched him struggle to process what had just occurred, saw him search desperately for some way to diminish what couldn't be diminished. When he finally stood, his movement cutting through the continued ovation, his voice carried a new edge, one that spoke of a man whose comfortable assumptions had just been obliterated in public. "Very impressive," he said, his tone managing to make the compliment sound like an insult. "Anyone can memorize one piece, but real musicians don't just perform, they create under pressure." The ballroom's energy shifted, the celebration pausing as Steinberg's words registered. He wasn't finished. The humiliation he'd planned to inflict on Amara had backfired spectacularly, but men like Richard Steinberg didn't accept defeat gracefully. They doubled down. "Let's see if you can handle something that actually requires skill," he continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his footing in familiar cruelty. "Something you can't possibly have prepared for." The trap was being reset, but this time, everyone in the room could see it coming. Steinberg's recovery was swift and vicious, like a cornered predator finding new ways to strike. The applause had barely faded when he strode toward the stage with renewed purpose, his earlier shock transformed into something far more dangerous: calculated malice. "That was a lovely dinner theater," he announced, his voice cutting through the lingering appreciation. "But anyone with YouTube and enough practice time can memorize a pretty song." He gestured dismissively toward Amara, who still stood on stage with the violin. "Real musicians prove themselves under real pressure." From his jacket, he produced a folded sheet of music with the theatrical flourish of a magician revealing his trick. "Mozart's Violin Concerto No. 3 in G major. First movement, sight reading only." His smile was razor-sharp as he held up the pages. "Let's separate the performers from the pretenders." The ballroom's energy shifted instantly. Musicians in the audience exchanged worried glances. They recognized what Steinberg was demanding. Mozart's Third was a notorious test piece, filled with technical landmines that could destroy even seasoned professionals. Sight reading it was something typically reserved for conservatory final exams, not public humiliation attempts. But as Steinberg climbed the stage steps, his true cruelty revealed itself. Under the bright spotlights, the sheet music in his hands was clearly damaged. Coffee stains obscured entire measures. Tears had removed crucial passages, and water damage had made key sections completely illegible. This wasn't an accident. It was sabotage disguised as a challenge. "Oops," he said with mock concern, holding up the ruined pages for the audience to see. "Looks like someone was careless with the only copy, but I'm sure that won't be a problem for someone with your extensive training." The cruelty was breathtaking in its calculation. He was demanding perfection while deliberately making it impossible, creating a scenario where failure was guaranteed and humiliation complete. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke up. This was Steinberg's world. His $5 million donation bought him the right to orchestrate whatever sadistic entertainment he chose. Amara studied the damaged sheet music, her face betraying nothing as she absorbed the full scope of his trap. Missing measures, illegible passages, entire sections rendered unreadable. It would be musical suicide to attempt this, professional embarrassment that would follow her for years. The smart play was to decline gracefully, to accept that she'd already proven her point with Bach. Instead, she handed the ruined pages back to him. "I won't need those," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. Steinberg's eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me?" "Mozart's Third Concerto in G major, first movement," Amara replied, adjusting the violin on her shoulder with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was about to do. "I'll play it from memory." The declaration sent ripples of disbelief through the audience. Playing Mozart from memory was difficult enough, but announcing it publicly raised the stakes to impossible heights. One missed note, one forgotten passage, and her earlier triumph would be completely erased by this spectacular failure. Steinberg's laugh was genuinely delighted now. How convenient! When you inevitably stumble through a butchered approximation, you can claim the missing sheet music confused you. Very clever. He gestured to the audience like a ringmaster preparing his greatest act. "Ladies and gentlemen, witness the delusions of someone who thinks memorizing pop songs qualifies as classical training. This is what happens when participation trophies meet actual standards." The phones came out again, but this time the energy was different. This wasn't anticipation of beauty, this was anticipation of destruction. Social media was already buzzing with updates. Waitress about to crash and burn trying Mozart. The hashtags were shifting from celebration to spectacle. But something had changed in Amara's posture. The nervous energy that had marked her earlier performance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like amusement. She closed her eyes and tilted her head slightly, as if listening to music only she could hear. "Before I begin," she said, her voice carrying a new authority that made even Steinberg pause, "I want everyone here to remember something about Mozart. He didn't write music to impress rich people at parties. He wrote it to prove that genius comes from places you'd never expect." The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more charged. Amara raised her bow, and for just a moment, her eyes found Steinberg's face again. "This one's for every person you've ever underestimated," she said. Then she began to play, and the world shifted on its axis. What emerged from the violin defied every law of musical possibility. Mozart's Concerto No. 3 poured forth in waves of technical perfection that left even the most seasoned musicians speechless. Amara's fingers danced across the fingerboard with supernatural precision, executing runs that typically took years to master while maintaining the lyrical beauty that made Mozart immortal. Every note was exactly where it belonged. Every phrase shaped with the kind of musical intelligence that couldn't be faked or approximated. But this wasn't mere technical display. This was Mozart as he was meant to be heard. Amara found the playful wit hidden in the composer's melodies, the mathematical perfection disguised as effortless charm. Her interpretation revealed layers of meaning that even professional recordings rarely captured, proving that she didn't just know the notes, she understood the soul behind them. Steinberg's face drained of color as the impossible continued to unfold before him. This wasn't someone who'd memorized a piece. This was someone who lived and breathed classical music at the highest level. The damaged sheet music forgotten in his hands told the story of his miscalculation. He'd assumed incompetence where genius stood waiting. At table 7, Elena Vasquez was no longer just watching. She was studying. Her trained eye caught every subtle detail of Amara's technique, every fingerwork pattern that spoke of world-class training. The recognition in her face grew stronger with each passing measure, pieces of a puzzle falling into place with each perfectly executed passage. The audience was beyond applause now. They sat in stunned silence, afraid that any sound might break the spell being woven around them. Phones recorded frantically, but their owners were too mesmerized to check the screens. This was the kind of performance that people would claim they'd witnessed for the rest of their lives. Social media exploded in real-time wonder. Comments flooded in faster than platforms could process them. This is impossible. Where has she been hiding? I'm crying actual tears. #Violin Queen forever. As the movement reached its triumphant conclusion, Amara's bow swept through the final flourish with authority that belonged on the world's greatest stages. The last note rang pure and true, hanging in the air like a challenge to anyone who'd ever doubted that excellence could emerge from unexpected places. The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds, long enough for everyone present to understand that they'd witnessed something that would change how they saw the world forever. The applause that erupted should have ended everything. Standing ovations swept across the ballroom like wildfire, with even the most skeptical audience members rising to their feet in stunned recognition. But Richard Steinberg wasn't finished. Humiliation had only sharpened his cruelty into something far more dangerous. "Stop!" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the celebration like a chainsaw. "Stop this ridiculous charade right now!" The applause faltered, confusion rippling through the crowd as Steinberg stormed across the stage. His face was flushed red with rage, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of his demolished assumptions. "You think I'm stupid?" he snarled, jabbing his finger inches from Amara's face. "You think any of us are stupid? This whole thing was planned from the beginning." He spun to face the audience, his voice rising to a roar. She obviously had this music memorized before tonight. Probably been practicing for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment to pull off her little sob story performance. Murmurs of uncertainty began to spread through the crowd. Steinberg was a master manipulator, and he knew exactly which doubts to plant and how to nurture them into full-blown suspicion. "Look at her!" he commanded, gesturing wildly at Amara. "Look at those hands. Those aren't waitress hands. Those are musician hands. This woman has been lying to all of us, playing some pathetic con game designed to make us feel guilty for our success." The phones that had been recording in wonder now captured something uglier. The systematic destruction of a miraculous moment by a man who couldn't accept that his worldview was wrong. "And another thing," Steinberg continued, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that the microphone picked up perfectly. "I know exactly what this is about. This is the same shakedown we see everywhere now. Minorities showing up at our events, our spaces, demanding special treatment and playing the victim when they don't get handed everything on a silver platter." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably, their earlier wonder now tainted by calculated doubt. Steinberg was rewriting the narrative in real time, transforming a moment of transcendent beauty into something suspicious and scheming. "You want to know the truth about people like her?" he pressed on, his cruelty reaching new depths. "They're professional victims. They study us, learn our weaknesses, then exploit our guilt for their own gain. This whole performance was designed to make us feel bad about being successful." From the back of the ballroom, Amara's catering manager appeared, his face pale with panic. Marcus Carter had built his business serving New York's elite, and his entire livelihood depended on maintaining their goodwill. Seeing his employee at the center of this explosive confrontation was his worst nightmare realized. "Miss Williams!" Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to crisis management. "Please step away from the instrument and return to work immediately." The words landed like physical blows. Amara stood on stage, still holding the violin, caught between the transcendent moment she'd just created and the brutal reality of her economic vulnerability. One phone call from Steinberg could destroy not just her job, but Marcus's entire business. That's right. Steinberg said, sensing victory. Back to where you belong, and take your little performance art project with you. But his cruelest blow was still coming. He leaned closer to the microphone, ensuring every word would be captured for the viral videos already spreading across social media. You know what the real tragedy is here? He said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. There are probably dozens of actually talented musicians, real musicians from good families with proper training, who will never get opportunities because spots are being handed out to diversity cases like this. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. He was suggesting that Amara's very presence was theft, that any success she achieved came at the expense of someone more deserving. It was the kind of dog-whistle racism that his crowd understood perfectly, disguised as concern for fairness and merit. Social media began to fracture in real time. The hashtags that had celebrated her moments before now battled with new ones. #diversityscam, #professionalvictim, #wheredidshecomefrom. The beautiful moment was being consumed by the very ugliness it had seemed to transcend. Amara stood frozen, the violin suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in her hands. The choice before her was stark. Retreat now and preserve what little security she had, or fight back and risk losing everything. Steinberg smiled as he watched her struggle, certain that he'd finally found the pressure point that would end this embarrassing episode forever. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap, with Amara trapped between retreat and ruin. Then a voice cut through the toxic air with the authority of someone who'd spent decades commanding the world's greatest concert halls. That's enough. Elena Vasquez rose from table 7 with the fluid grace of a woman accustomed to standing ovations. At 62, she remained one of the most respected violinists alive, her opinion carrying weight that even Steinberg couldn't dismiss. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward her as she began walking toward the stage. I know world-class playing when I hear it, Elena announced, her accented English carrying clearly through the sound system. And what we just witnessed was extraordinary by any standard. Steinberg's confidence faltered as murmurs of recognition rippled through the crowd. Elena Vasquez wasn't some bleeding-heart liberal. She was a musical legend whose endorsement could launch careers or end them with a single word. Furthermore, Elena continued, reaching the stage with measured steps, I know this young woman personally. Amara Williams was one of my students at Juilliard from 2019 to 2022, full scholarship, top 5% of her class. I wrote her recommendation letters myself. The revelation hit the ballroom like a thunderclap. Steinberg's face went ashen as his carefully constructed narrative crumbled in real time. This wasn't some diversity hire or professional victim. This was a Juilliard-trained virtuoso whose credentials were now being verified by one of classical music's most respected figures. Elena reached into her evening bag and produced her phone, swiping through photos with the practiced ease of a grandmother showing off family pictures. Here she is at her sophomore recital. Here's her junior year masterclass with Itzhak Perlman. And here, she held up the phone for the cameras to see, is her acceptance letter to the Vienna Philharmonic's Young Artist Program dated March 2022. The photo showed a beaming Amara holding an official letter bearing the Vienna Philharmonic's seal. The program Elena referenced was legendary. Only 6 violinists worldwide were selected each year, and graduates typically went on to join the world's most prestigious orchestras. She declined the position, Elena continued, her voice carrying both pride and sadness, because her grandmother needed emergency surgery, and the family couldn't afford both the medical bills and her living expenses in Vienna. The human story behind Amara's absence from the classical music world began to crystallize for the audience. This wasn't failure or lack of talent. This was sacrifice of the highest order, choosing family over personal glory in a way that made her musical gifts even more profound. Dr. Jonathan Mitchell, principal violinist for the New York Philharmonic, stood at table 12. I remember her audition tape, he called out, his voice carrying the weight of professional validation. We discussed bringing her in for our fellowship program. Elena's right. She's conservatory level, possibly beyond. More voices joined the chorus of recognition. Sarah Kim, a music critic for the New York Times who'd been live tweeting the evening, held up her phone. My followers are sending me performance videos of Amara from her Juilliard days. She was already being compared to the greats before she was 25. The social media tide was turning rapidly. #Amara Williams began trending alongside #Juilliard Prodigy and #Classical Genius. Comments flooded in from musicians around the world who remembered her performances, her competition victories, her promise that had seemed to vanish into thin air. But the most devastating blow to Steinberg's credibility came from an unexpected source: his own table. Patricia Steinberg stood slowly, her face pale but determined. In her hands, she held her own phone, displaying a charity organization's website. "Richard," she said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "the Harmony Foundation, the charity I've been running for the past 5 years, the one that provides instruments to underprivileged children. Amara has been volunteering with us for 2 years, teaching violin to kids in Harlem and the Bronx, for free." The final piece of Steinberg's narrative collapsed. Not only was Amara legitimately trained and extraordinarily talented, but she'd been giving back to her community even while struggling to survive economically herself. Elena stepped closer to Amara, placing a protective hand on her former student's shoulder. "What you've witnessed tonight isn't a scam or performance art," she declared, her voice ringing with finality. "It's what happens when privilege tries to crush excellence, and excellence refuses to be silenced." The ballroom erupted in applause again, but this time it carried a different energy. Not just appreciation for musical beauty, but recognition of justice being served. Steinberg stood alone on his stage, his empire of assumptions crumbling around him as 300 phones captured his moment of complete defeat. Steinberg's world was collapsing in real time, but cornered predators are most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. His face cycled through rage, humiliation, and finally settled on something far more sinister: the cold calculation of a man preparing to burn everything down rather than accept defeat. "This is all very touching," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. "But words are cheap, and stories can be fabricated. If she's really as good as you all claim, then let's put it to the ultimate test." He gestured toward the back of the ballroom where the evening's scheduled entertainment waited, a full chamber orchestra hired for the gala's closing ceremony. 12 world-class musicians sat with their instruments, having watched the entire drama unfold with professional fascination. "Beethoven's Violin Concerto in D major," Steinberg announced, his challenge echoing through the suddenly tense ballroom. "Full orchestral accompaniment. No sheet music, no preparation, no excuses. If she can perform at the level you're all claiming, this should be child's play." The audacity of the demand sent shockwaves through the musical community present. Beethoven's Violin Concerto was considered one of the most technically and emotionally demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. Performing it with a full orchestra required not just individual brilliance, but the ability to lead and collaborate with other musicians in real time. It was a test typically reserved for the most elite concert soloists in the world. Elena's face went pale. "Richard, that's completely unreasonable. Even seasoned professionals wouldn't attempt that without rehearsal time." "Then she should decline gracefully," Steinberg interrupted, his smile returning with renewed cruelty. "But let's make this interesting. My entire $10 million donation, the money that funds all these precious diversity programs you care so much about, against a simple public admission." He paused dramatically, ensuring every phone in the room captured his words. "When she fails, and we all know she will, I want everyone here to acknowledge that merit-based selection is the only fair way forward. No more diversity quotas, no more special programs, no more handouts disguised as opportunities. The stakes couldn't have been higher. $10 million would fund music education programs for thousands of underprivileged children for years to come. But accepting the challenge meant risking not just personal humiliation, but providing Steinberg with a propaganda victory that could damage diversity initiatives across the entire cultural landscape. "And if she succeeds?" Elena demanded, her protective instincts fully engaged. Steinberg's laugh was genuinely amused. "If she can perform Beethoven's concerto flawlessly with full orchestra, with no rehearsal and no preparation, then I'll not only honor my donation, I'll double it to $20 million, and I'll personally fund a scholarship program in her name." The ballroom buzzed with electric tension. Social media exploded as the challenge spread beyond the gala to millions of viewers worldwide. Beethoven Challenge began trending instantly, with musicians, critics, and casual observers weighing in on whether such a performance was even humanly possible under these conditions. But the most telling reaction came from the orchestra itself. The musicians began preparing their instruments without being asked, their professional excitement overriding any concerns about the social dynamics at play. This was the kind of musical moment that performers lived for, the chance to witness or participate in something potentially legendary. Conductor Margaret Carter approached the stage, her expression mixing professional concern with irrepressible curiosity. "Miss Williams," she said carefully, "performing Beethoven's concerto without rehearsal is, well, it's unprecedented. Even if you know the piece perfectly, coordinating with a full orchestra requires—" "I understand the risks," Amara interrupted quietly, her voice carrying a new authority that made everyone listen more carefully. "But he's not really challenging me to play Beethoven. He's challenging everything I represent, everyone who looks like me, everyone who's been told they don't belong in places like this." She turned to face Steinberg directly, the violin still cradled in her arms like a weapon waiting to be wielded. "You want to make this about more than music? Fine. But when I succeed, not if, when, you're going to do more than write a check. You're going to sit in that front row seat and listen while I prove that excellence doesn't have a color, doesn't have a zip code, and sure as hell doesn't need your permission to exist." The ballroom fell into absolute silence as the full weight of the moment settled over everyone present. This wasn't just a musical performance anymore. It was a referendum on justice, on merit, on the very nature of who deserved to be heard. Steinberg's smile widened, certain he'd finally created an impossible scenario. "Then let's make history," he said, settling into his front row seat like an emperor awaiting the fall of Rome. Amara raised her violin, nodded to Conductor Carter, and prepared to prove that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with a single, perfect note. What followed transcended every definition of musical performance and entered the realm of pure magic. The opening orchestral introduction began with the kind of precision that only world-class musicians could deliver, but when Amara's violin joined the conversation, something extraordinary happened. She didn't just play with the orchestra, she transformed them into an extension of her artistic vision. Every phrase she shaped influenced their dynamics. Every breath she took guided their tempo. Every emotional nuance she expressed elevated their collective performance to heights none of them had experienced before. Beethoven's concerto in D major became something more than music. It became a dialogue between centuries of human struggle and triumph. Amara found every hidden voice in the composition, every moment where the composer had embedded his own battles against deafness, poverty, and social rejection. She played not just the notes, but the story behind them, the hope that had sustained Beethoven through his darkest moments. The technical demands that should have been impossible became effortless under her bow. The notorious double stops that challenged even seasoned professionals flowed like natural speech. The cadenzas that typically required months of preparation emerged as spontaneous conversations between her soul and the instrument. She was operating beyond technique now, in that rarefied space where music and spirit merged into something approaching the divine. Steinberg's face told the story of a man watching his entire worldview collapse in real time. The smug certainty had drained away completely, replaced by something approaching terror as he realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. This wasn't just musical excellence. This was the kind of artistry that redefined what human beings were capable of achieving. The orchestra members themselves were transformed by the experience. Musicians who had performed with the world's greatest soloists found themselves pushed to new heights by Amara's leadership. Her musical intelligence was so profound that she anticipated their every need, supported their contributions, and elevated their collective performance beyond anything they'd thought possible. Social media has become a global phenomenon. Amara Williams was trending in 12 languages as musicians around the world shared the live streams. Comments poured in from conservatory professors, symphony conductors, and critics who were witnessing something they'd never expected to see. The Vienna Philharmonic's official account posted, "The invitation remains open, always." But the most profound transformation was happening in the audience itself. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was revelation. Every person in that ballroom was being forced to confront their own assumptions about talent, about worthiness, about who deserved to be heard. The applause that punctuated each movement wasn't just appreciation, it was confession, a collective acknowledgement of how wrong they'd all been. As the concerto moved toward its triumphant finale, Amara's playing reached heights that seemed to bend the very laws of physics. The orchestra followed her into musical territory that none of them had ever explored, their faces glowing with the joy of musicians experiencing something truly unprecedented. The final chord rang through the Metropolitan Arts Center with the force of a revolution completed. The silence that followed lasted exactly 12 seconds, long enough for everyone present to understand that they'd witnessed something that would define the rest of their lives. Then the explosion came. Not just applause, but a sonic eruption of recognition that shook the building's foundations. People weren't just standing. They were weeping, shouting, grabbing strangers in spontaneous embraces of shared witnessing. The orchestra members themselves stood and applauded, their professional reserve shattered by what they'd just participated in. Steinberg sat frozen in his front row seat, his face a mask of defeat so complete it bordered on the existential. The $20 million he'd promised was the least of his concerns now. His entire identity had been obliterated by 90 minutes of musical perfection. Elena Vasquez was openly crying as she climbed onto the stage, embracing her former student with the fierce pride of a mentor watching the prophecy fulfilled. "The scholarship offer still stands," she whispered. "Vienna, Berlin, London, anywhere you want to go. The world is ready for you now." But the most powerful moment came when Patricia Steinberg approached her husband's seat. In her hands, she carried divorce papers that she'd apparently been contemplating for months. "I can't be married to someone who would try to destroy something so beautiful," she said quietly, her words captured by nearby phones. "This ends tonight, Richard. All of it." The transformation was complete. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been delivered with such overwhelming beauty that even its targets couldn't deny its power. As the crowd continued its thunderous appreciation, Amara stood center stage, still holding the violin that had become her instrument of revolution, and smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd just changed the world. 6 months later, Amara Williams stood in the wings of Carnegie Hall, adjusting the collar of her midnight blue concert gown. The sold-out venue buzzed with anticipation as audience members took their seats for what critics were calling the most anticipated classical debut in a generation. Tonight, she would perform Beethoven's Violin Concerto, the same piece that had changed everything, with the New York Philharmonic. Her grandmother sat in the front row, tears already streaming down her face. The surgery had been successful, funded by a GoFundMe campaign that had raised over $2 million from people around the world who'd been moved by that viral night at the Metropolitan Arts Center. Next to her sat Elena Vasquez, whose mentorship had resumed immediately after the gala, and Marcus Carter, whose catering business now specialized in events celebrating diversity and inclusion. The Guarneri violin, the same instrument that had given voice to her revolution, now belonged to the Amara Williams Foundation, established with Steinberg's $20 million donation. The foundation provided instruments and training to talented young musicians regardless of their economic background, ensuring that no one would have to choose between dreams and survival the way she once had. Richard Steinberg's empire had crumbled within weeks of that night. Corporate sponsors abandoned him, his board of directors forced him out, and his company now operated under new leadership committed to genuine diversity initiatives. He'd become a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating people based on prejudice. But perhaps the most profound change was cultural. #Amara Williams had become more than a hashtag. It had become a movement. Music schools reported unprecedented applications from underrepresented communities, while corporations scrambled to examine their own biases in hiring and promotion practices. As the lights dimmed and she walked onto the Carnegie Hall stage, Amara carried with her the dreams of everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. The thunderous applause that greeted her entrance wasn't just for her, it was for every person who'd chosen excellence over acceptance, who'd refused to let others define their worth. She raised her violin, found her center in the expectant silence, and prepared to remind the world once again that true talent recognizes no boundaries. Sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger, it's excellence. And excellence, once unleashed, can never be silenced again. What would you have played in Amara's position? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, pass it on to someone who needs to remember that their talents matter. Subscribe for more stories of everyday heroes who change the world, one note at a time.